You're costing the taxpayers billions. Why are you doing that?
Earlier this week, Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen appeared in a Senate hearing. It didn't get a whole lot of attention, let's face it. There was a lot going on this week. But there is one moment that I want to draw your attention to. This is some questioning with Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, and it has to do with some of the decisions being made here. Senator Kennedy thinks for political purposes that are really affecting our economy and could affect our economy in the long run. Take a look at this.
Now, if you personally were borrowing money, would you rather pay 5.4% interest or 4.4% interest? Ma'am?
The less, the better.
Okay. Then why aren't you doing that with federal borrowing?
Well, in federal borrowing, our objective is to issue at least cost over time and not to try to time the market.
Yeah, but you are timing the market. You issued a press release back in November that you were going to try to time the market. You issued a press release. You said, we're going to start borrowing more short-term debt. At the beginning of 2023, our short-term debt was about 15%. And last November, you said we're going to increase that. And now it's about 22, 23%. You're costing the taxpayers billions. Why are you doing that? Because what you're doing is stimulating the market. You're pumping money into the economy. And Jay Powell is over here beavering away, trying to reduce inflation. You're beavering away, trying to increase it. And the only reason I can figure that y'all are doing that is to try to give the economy a sugar high 5 months before an election. Why else would anybody want to borrow at 5% when you can borrow at 4%?
Boy, oh boy, at a time when we're spending all our attention on Trump's trial in New York and the Hunter Biden trial and polls for the election, I wish everyone saw this exchange. Akash, I know this is speaking right to Americans for Prosperity, all of this spending of money that we don't have, that our children or grandchildren are going to have to pay back, and how they're sort of doing it short-term versus long-term rates. Meanwhile, interest rates are still sky high and no sign that they're going to budge. And inflation continues to tick up. Make sense of it all for me, Akash.
No, that's exactly right. When the Democrats had full control over Congress in President Biden's first 2 years, they spent an additional $6 trillion above baseline. The Inflation Reduction Act, the American Rescue Plan, the CHIPS Act, what have you. That $6 trillion created this inflation crisis that Jerome Powell now is in a very difficult position trying to get under control. But on the subject of interest, as a result of all that spending, Larry, our net interest today exceeds how much we spend on national defense, and it exceeds how much we spend on Medicare. Just to put that into context, the amount that we spend to keep our country safe and the amount that we spend on Medicare for our seniors, both of those are less than we pay just to borrow money to fund our federal government. That is absolutely absurd. This administration, the Democrats, have been an abject failure when it comes to spending. But as we look ahead, the major inflection point is going to be what we call the fiscal cliff next year, right? We have expiring tax cuts. We have a debt limit deal. We're going to have government funding. This is a major, major inflection point to start to right the ship on federal spending. It can get very wonky very quickly, but I would very much encourage your listeners and your viewers to start paying attention to this issue, start seeing that phrase, the fiscal cliff and what have you. It's much bigger than just the tax side of things, because if we don't use that opportunity next spring, the first 100 days of the new Congress to get spending under control, we're going to be in a whole heap of trouble over the next decade. And I think Janet Yellen's words show us perfectly why that is.
Yeah, and Elaine, it's the sort of debt Damocles hanging over all of us. And I think when we talk about it at this level, and when Senator Kennedy, who knows what he's talking about here, has this exchange, I don't think it hits home to the individual American, to the small business owner, to the big business owner even. I know. Can you sort of put that in perspective for us in terms of the ripple effect, how this affects us on a daily basis? Because I don't think people notice.
Well, I mean, the way it affects us on a daily basis is just through the higher cost of everything that we're doing. We hit a grim milestone about a week or so ago, and that's that inflation has actually reached 20%. It's a grim milestone for Americans. But our polling of small business owners, 2/3 of them say that the costs that they're paying, the price increases that they're paying, are actually higher than what's being reported. And that's a big deal for our small business owners because they are really suffering a disproportionate effect under this inflation because they don't have as much buying power. Energy is high for them as well, but everyday ordinary Americans, they feel it when they go to the grocery store. They feel it when they go to the gas station, and it's hurting all of them. And Washington just doesn't seem to understand it. Janet Yellen's just trying to put lipstick on a pig as usual. Remember, she's the one that doubled down on the narrative that inflation was transitory till we hit 9%, and she had to actually admit that it in fact wasn't.
Yeah. And quickly, Elaine, if I could follow up on that, because we keep hearing from the White House that when inflation is raised and the fact that it costs more for everything, they turn it around and say, yeah, that's corporate greed. It's business owners who are keeping prices high. But I think you just alluded to the fact that your polls show quite that. This has nothing to do with people wanting to increase prices to make things more expensive. It's that's what they have to do to cover the cost because all of their goods and services are more expensive, right?
Yes, all signs that the people in Washington, including President Biden, have no idea how businesses work because they've spent their entire careers in Washington, D.C. and have never signed the front of a paycheck.
Yeah, and Robert, that brings us to, I think, who you're representing here, Association of Mature American Citizens, and so many of them are on fixed incomes, and boy, this hurts them more than anyone else.
It does. So both Elaine and Akash are exactly right. And older Americans who, as Elaine pointed out, who had saved and saved and saved, and not only are they on fixed incomes, but anything they have in savings, they put 100 pennies into the bank for every dollar. Those pennies are now worth 80 pennies. And so it is a devastating thing to see both the cuts in our energy production, which is one of the drivers of inflation, and as Akash said, the $6 trillion over regular order in the first year, but actually it's closer to 8 or more now. And so what did that do? What Janet Yellen is trying to do is cover up what the horrendous decisions that they've made. What they did is they overspent, which drove inflation, as everybody said, to 9% in August of 2022, which then caused the Fed, I think wrongly, to believe they had a high growth economy. So they were going to raise interest rates, which are now at a 22-year high. And what people don't realize is that interest rate also applies to the national debt. And so that same interest rate that we're all struggling under, the same way that Vietnam saw pine boxes coming home, we're seeing the economy come home to every single family in the country. I'm here in Maine. You walk around to homes, people can barely afford anything right now. And so both at the state level and at the federal level, what you've had is irresponsible management of the piece of the economy that belongs to the government. They have over-mandated, overspent, you've got high interest, and Yellen is basically what Kennedy's pointing out, is trying to cover that up with massive, massive borrowing, and at the same time covering off the expenses of borrowing in ways that are going to only drive interest higher. And by the way, the same thing Biden's doing. He's trying to forgive educational loans and buy votes that way. Bottom line is they have really screwed it up, and the average American feels it at home.
Akash, this also, it should be pointed out, is sadly a bipartisan problem. When Republicans are in the White House and running this Department of Treasury, the story is much the same, not quite to the same extent, I don't think, but it's not dissimilar. I'd love for you to comment on that aspect of it and how we can finally, make this a bipartisan fix instead of a bipartisan problem. And also the part where Senator Kennedy pointed out that this is wrapped in politics, that the way that they're financing the debt on short term and pumping cash back in the economy, it's really just to sort of give the illusion that the economy is doing better than it is just to get to November.
That's absolutely right. They are very creative with the manner of their different vote buying schemes in the Biden White House. But what they failed to realize is that it is exactly that kind of vote buying that has driven this inflation crisis to begin with, right? Whether it's student loan bailouts or giveaways to the electric vehicle industry, or it's quote unquote industrial policy, as they call it, vote buying is driving inflation and it's making Americans miserable. Now, you allude to the fact that this has been a bipartisan problem. I think, frankly, the manner in which we fix that is for Republican voters to demand that this is a priority for their elected officials. If you go back to the Tea Party wave coming into 2010, 2011 was the last time we actually scored significant wins on spending, right? The sequester, the budget caps, things like that. You may or may not like those or think that they're terribly significant, but it was very clear that Republican voters demanded that Republican electeds make controlling spending a priority, and they responded accordingly. Now, as we've talked about, there are a number of other issues. The border is a mess. Our culture is going crazy. And, Republicans are trying to fight back at a lot of different things. But I think if we don't come into 2025, regardless of whether Republicans have full control or one chamber or just the White House or what have you, if Republicans in Washington do not treat spending as a priority, getting it under control and really fighting back, and it's not going to be easy because the media is going to demagogue them, but they have got to stand up and fight, because if they do not do so, not only are Americans going to continue to feel economic pain that they felt under this inflation crisis, but Republicans are going to continue to be punished at the ballot box, because at that point, what's the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats when it comes to the economy? And so I think there's a very clear message here for Republican candidates and elected officials who are going to be on the ballot this November, which is to prioritize spending and have real concrete plans to fight back on Bidenomics come January.
Yeah, thank you. I hope they do that. There is a weird phenomenon, though. It seems like Republicans, when they're challenging an incumbent, they do get elected on the promise to get to this town and cut spending and bring us back to fiscal sanity. But then something happens when they get into Washington and they're convinced that nobody ever wins re-election by going back to their district and pointing out all the things they didn't spend taxpayer money on. It's only when they bring goodies back to their district that they get reelected. But I think the bottom line here is nobody's electing them in the first place just so they can keep getting elected. We're electing them so they can get the job done and then maybe not worry about getting reelected. But I guess I'm a little naive. I don't belong in this town.